Phil and Stu, they're your buddies, and it's your bachelor party, and
Those two love you.
How did Todd Phillips go from dropping out of film school to orchestrating the single greatest comedy phenomenon of the 21st century in The Hangover, and then completely taking over the genre himself?
This isn't the real Caesar's Palace, is it?
Well, through creative and financial risks that would put his career in jeopardy.
Standing in an alley in the middle of Las Vegas at 4 a.m. and saying, boy, that was really funny, but is anybody going to see this film?
And because he stuck to his guns no matter the situation. Todd's story is one of success, failure, rebirth, and betting on himself, unlike any other big-time director. Like many great success stories, Todd's did not start by graduating college valedictorian, struggling through 8 years of grad school to get that PhD, and by standing in the corporate ladder for 20 years to finally achieve the success he had been dreaming of. Torn between a decision of continuing his education at NYU, arguably the most prestigious film school in the world, and making his first feature, Todd was in for quite the dilemma.
Honestly, I dropped out because I was finishing my first movie, which was called Hated,
Right.
which is
is
documentary
awesome, by the
about
way.
Gigi Allen, and I needed the money to finish the movie, so I just saved the money on that, semester.
And his decision to choose real-world experience and get an early start on his filmography would prove to be a wise one. Hated would go on to become one of the most successful student films of its time and would even get a limited theatrical release. Oh, and I bet you didn't know that John Wayne Gacy created official artwork for the movie. You know, the serial killer who would dress up as a clown and rape and murder young boys? Yeah, Todd got him to agree to work on commission from prison for $50 and a sexy photo of himself. Yeah, Todd's an interesting guy. But on that note, before Todd officially became the comedy prodigy we all know and love, he would drive the success of Hated into a mini career as a documentary filmmaker as he went on to write, direct, and produce Frat House, which would be celebrated as the only HBO documentary to ever be banned from broadcast.
And you can't get that film released? And that's what the kids come out, they claim, they say they were drunk and stoned when they signed releases, which is true. And,
But that's how they normally are.
the status of that movie is still up in the air.
And would get back to his roots with Bittersweet Motel, which tells the story of the American rock band Phish. But you're probably here for Todd's narrative career and wondering how it all came to be. Well, let's dive in. While Todd had a successful documentary run, no one could have predicted what would come next. The year was 2000, just 1 year after not only the comedy movie genre, but the industry as a whole would be changed forever by the success of American Pie. Studios demanded the exact style of frat humor that Todd encapsulates. This was right place, right time on steroids. And so Road Trip was born, and it would not only carry the raunchy teen comedy momentum that American Pie started, but it would also reignite the Road Trip comedy flame. Taking a page from American Pie's book, Road Trip would bring together a cast without any prominent stars, and even cast Stifler, before he was an icon, as a lead. The movie subsequently crushed it at the box office, and Hollywood had no idea what it was in for, as this would also launch the narrative career of the greatest comedy movie director of all time. Believe it or not, there was actually a time before Vince Vaughn and Will Ferrell were A-listers.
Vince wasn't a huge comedy guy at that time. I remember having to convince DreamWorks to put Vince in Old School, and and Will Ferrell even. He'd been on Saturday Night Live, but he hadn't done Elf yet.
And this would all end in 2003 when they teamed up with Todd to make the legendary comedy Old School, which also starred Luke Wilson, about three 30-somethings who start their own fraternity and find themselves at war with the dean. While it wasn't as big of a box office hit as Road Trip, it was a success nonetheless, and cemented Todd as the de facto comedy movie leader. This movie wouldn't just ignite Luke, Vince, and Will's careers, but it would also give birth to the film career of who many consider to be the godfather of 21st century comedy.
Old School was a hit. Yeah. And that opened the floodgates. They allowed us to do 40-Year-Old Virgin.
But it wasn't just a financial win, because it would also spark one of the greatest studio director partnerships I've ever seen. Thanks to the success of Old School, Warner Brothers would give him the keys to the Starsky and Hutch movie, and honestly, this is without question Todd's most underrated comedy. I would go as far to say that this is at worst Todd's second best comedy. But not every movie can be perfect, and Todd would have his only bomb in the 2006 comedy School for Scoundrels. The movie would not only bomb at the box office, but with critics and audiences alike. He should have just stuck with Warner Brothers, but thankfully he corrected this error with all of his future comedies. And he really got f***ed over with School for Scoundrels, but on short notice, the Weinsteins told him that it had to be a PG-13 comedy, causing for last-second rewrites, and not allowing him to make the movie that he wanted to make.
I also think the fact that that movie was PG-13, it probably should have been R-rated. It just should have been edgier, you know.
This compromise really shows in the final product, but this only makes me further appreciate what Todd was able to pull off with the aforementioned PG-13 comedy in Starsky and Hutch. But this wasn't the only messy situation that Todd found himself in this year. Todd was also set to direct the comedy classic Borat, but dropped out due to creative differences.
We were making a different movie, so it's not that painful because, quite honestly, Borat, the movie that we all know, was a far better concept than what we were doing.
If there's one thing that you can say for sure about Todd, it's that he sticks to his principles no matter the situation. But 2006 would prove to be just a small bump in the road, as Todd's life and the comedy movie genre as a whole were about to change forever.
As you say, I was nicely successful before The Hangover. That nicely successful was more successful than I ever thought I'd be in my whole life.
He was about to go from being one of the better comedy movie directors to the single greatest comedy movie director of all time. Todd would team up with a complete no-name in Zach Galifianakis and would pair him up with Bradley Cooper and Ed Helms, two established actors, but far from A-listers. They would go on to create the greatest comedy phenomenon of the 21st century in The Hangover. But did you know this movie almost didn't get made?
But it was hard to get this thing.
It was hard to get it made, and I understand why.
Yeah.
It's a comedy starring people that they didn't really know yet. And so, you know, it is a business, and I understood it.
Turns out executives wanted Jake Gyllenhaal, Jonah Hill, and Paul Rudd to be cast instead. It even got to the point that Todd offered to forfeit his salary on the project in exchange for a percentage of profits just to get the movie made. And the studio accepted, and the rest is history. But the studio would only give him 15 days to shoot the movie, which, mind you, is roughly 1/5 of the time that the average Hollywood production has to shoot. But the movie would turn out to be Todd's best work and would go on to become the highest grossing R-rated comedy of all time. So when it came time for the sequel, instead of working for free, the studio paid him $10 million and signed him onto another comedy in Due Date, both of which would be great commercial successes. And just like that, Warner Brothers would be begging him to make the third and final installment of the Hangover trilogy. Just like the prior two, it did quite well at the box office, even if critics tore it apart. But honestly, I find The Hangover Part 3 to be the better of the two sequels. I consider this to be the single most underrated comedy sequel of all time. But we were about to be in for a massive paradigm shift. Comedy's leading man was about to completely reinvent himself. Up to this point, Todd had exclusively been known as the straight comedy man and had built an entire empire of the genre. Things would start to change in 2016 though, as Todd would transition into more serious waters with the dramedy War Dogs, starring Jonah Hill and Miles Teller.
It's a tricky movie because tonally it's a little bit different than the other films I've made. So it did take a little while, the scripting process.
Then he would get really serious by reuniting with Bradley Cooper, but only this time, instead of a laugh fest, it was to produce the very serious drama A Star Is Born, which also featured Dave Chappelle. Kind of strange when all these funny people get together and make this super serious body of work, but it was a really great movie nonetheless. But why? What was going on? Why was the man who made a killing making raunch fests and packing theaters with his boundary-pushing comedies stepping away completely? It's not necessarily because he wanted to, but because he viewed it as literally impossible to make a great comedy anymore. And so he went in the polar opposite direction with The Joker in 2019.
I think a lot of people feel left-footed in this world, sort of out of step, and the movie ultimately is about empathy for people like that. What happens maybe if we don't treat people with empathy?
This, of course, would gross over $1 billion at the box office and was nothing short of a masterpiece. He followed it up with the sequel in 2024 Joker Folie à Deux, which got panned pretty hard, but honestly, I didn't think it was that bad. By the way, if you love Todd Phillips' style of humor and just the style of humor that is encapsulated by the 2000s comedy movies, I actually recently premiered my 2000s style comedy Hometown Summer at the Michigan Theater, and you can check out the trailer in the pinned comment in the description below. But in the aftermath of the Joker sequel, Todd announced that he was officially done with DC. So what's next? He actually has not ruled out a return to comedy. In fact, Bradley Cooper has been pressing for another Hangover movie as well.
So it would be a shame if we didn't just get the band back together to at least work together. I don't know that it's Hangover 4.
But could he actually return? I mean, it's been over a decade at this point since he's dipped his toes in the R-rated comedy movie arena. I would argue that he not only still has it, but that the best could still be to come. Just look at Dave Chappelle. The man was the face of comedic television with Chappelle's Show in the early 2000s, while simultaneously crushing it on stage as a stand-up comic. And then he left the game for a decade. But when he came back, he was better than ever. I've actually got to see Chappelle in person a few times in recent years, and I would say he's a lot funnier now than he was back then, and if I'm being honest, Chappelle's Show is by far my favorite live action show of all time. Seth MacFarlane, he's been in the game since the 90s, but the recent TED TV show was some of the best work he's ever done. And Vince Vaughn stepped into the comedy arena in 96 with Swingers, but didn't peak until nearly a decade afterwards. The point is that if you were hilarious at one point, you don't just stop being funny. If/when Todd's next comedy is announced, we shouldn't just be excited. We should be like pre-ordering tickets to opening weekend level excited. Because if there's one thing we've learned about Todd, it's that when he commits to something, he goes all in, and he sticks to the guns that made him a comedy legend. And now that you know Todd Phillips' story, you might be wondering what exactly about him makes him the greatest comedy movie director of all time. Well, I actually broke down all of the ingredients behind his comedic genius here.